Why do people call Northerners Hausa-Fulani? Who were the Hausa? Who were the Fulani? Did you know the Fulani did not even originate from Nigeria? So, who are the Fulani? What was their identity before they settled in northern Nigeria? And what was Hausaland like before they took over? This video will go deep into the origins and history of the Fulani's conquest of Hausaland. The story will be divided into 4 parts. 1. Hausaland before the Fulani's Jihad. 2. Who were the Fulani and where did they come from? 3. What were the causes of the 19th century Fulani's Jihad? And number 4. Usman and Fodio and the Jihad in Hausaland. Now, let's take a step back and imagine a time when Hausa states were powerful, boasting thriving trade routes, great cities and kings, ruling with absolute authority. But then, everything changed. These once mighty kingdoms began to fall one by one. Why? What weakened them so much that a group of pastoralists, the Fulanis, could rise and take over? Was it endless internal wars, corrupt rulers, or was it something deeper? The Fulanis were never kings or rulers, just nomads with cattle and merchants moving across the vast Sahel. So how did they, of all people, rise to control Hausaland and much of West Africa? And by the end of this video, we will answer an even bigger question. Usman and Fodio and other Fulani scholars believe that the way Islam was being practiced at the time was impure. Many rulers mixed Islamic belief with traditional practices. This is called syncretism. Simply put, they practiced Islam alongside their traditional religions. For Usman and Fodio, this was unacceptable, and so a movement began. A holy war to purify Islam and build an empire based on Islamic law. But was it really just about religion? Or was this a clever ploy for the Fulani to take control of the entire regions? The question remains, was this truly a religious war? Or was there more to it, like a hidden political and economic agenda? Let's find out together. Hello, welcome back to Edu History TV. If this is your first time here, you are in the right place. At Edu History TV, we tell authentic African history by Africans and for Africans. But here's the thing, if you don't subscribe right now, you might never find us again, and trust me, you don't want to miss out. So hit that subscribe button and check out our other videos for more fascinating African history. Now, let's get into today's story. Before the Fulani took over, Hausaland was a land of powerful kingdoms, great cities, thriving trade routes, and kings who ruled with absolute power. But then, something happened. What were the Hausa people doing before the Fulani conquest? What led to their downfall? And how did a group of cattle herders, the Fulani, manage to take control of an entire region? Today, we uncover the forgotten history of Hausaland before the 19th century Fulani's Jihad. Shall we begin? The fall of the Songhai Empire following the Moroccan conquest was catastrophic for the Western Sahel, but for Central West Africa, it had a different impact. Instead of widespread destruction, it created opportunities for the Hausa states to compete for dominance. Throughout the 18th century, Katsina held the position of leadership, emerging as the chief commercial and cultural hub in Hausaland. Despite repeated attacks from Gobi, it maintained its status due to its control of the caravan routes to North Africa. Meanwhile, Zamfara rose to power in the first half of the 18th century, conquering Kano in 1700. By the mid-century, it was competing fiercely with Katsina for dominance in Hausaland. Gobi too emerged as a powerful force, waging constant wars against Zamfara and Katsina. By the end of the century, it appeared to be the most dominant Hausa state, but in reality, years of warfare had weakened it internally. This vulnerability later paved way for Usman and Fodio's victory. Kano, despite its prosperity, was significantly weakened by continuous conflict with Gobi and Zamfara. It suffered a major defeat in 1770 at the hands of Gobi. By the late 18th century, Kano, though still internally peaceful and economically stable, had become a third-rate power in Hausaland. Zaria faced a similar fate, frequently attacked by the Kwararafa. To the east of Hausaland, the Kanuri state of Borno had already passed its peak by the 18th century, though it still exacted tribute from some Hausa states. Its military strength had declined and its territorial control had shrunk. This made it vulnerable to repeated raids from Kwararafa to the south and Tuaregs to the north. The roots of Borno's decline lay in its monarchy. Unlike their predecessor, the Mice no longer led troops into battle. The 6 Mice of the 18th century all died in their capital, preferring to focus on the harems, arts and literature, leaving governance in the hands of bureaucrats. As a result, Borno was an easy target for the Fulani reformer, who later drove Mai Ahmed into exile. By the early 19th century, Central West Africa was divided and weakened. The Hausa states were constantly at war with one another, while Borno's ruler had become weak and ineffective. The conditions were perfect for Fulani supremacy to take hold. But before we dive into how the Fulani gained control, let's first understand who they were and where they came from. The exact origin of the Fulani remain debated. Their distinct features, light skin, straight hair, thin lips and slender physique, have led to theories suggesting they migrated from Persia, India or the Middle East. Other beliefs they descended from non-Negro population in ancient Ghana. However, today, the Fulani are classified among the major Negro ethnic groups of West Africa. Their language, Fufude, is closely related to that of the Tukolo people of Senegal. Historically, the Fulani first appeared in West Africa in Tekru, modern-day Senegal, around the 9th century, making this their probable points of origin. Many historians trace their West African lineage to Futa Toro in Senegal, which succeeded the ancient kingdom of Tekru. Initially, the Fulani were strict pastoralists, living as nomadic cattle herders. However, following the fall of Old Ghana in the 13th century, they began migrating eastward across the Sahelian region with their cattle. They appeared in Hausaland with the first recorded reference dating back to 1422. Today, the Fulani are found throughout the Sahelian belt, stretching from Senegal to northern Cameroon, with their largest population in Futa Jalon in Guinea, Masina in Mali, and Adamawa in Nigeria. The Fulani can be divided into 2 main groups: the town Fulani, Fulani Gida, and the cattle Fulani, Ororoji. The town Fulani settled in urban areas, intermarried with local farmers like the Hausa, and adopted Islam. Over time, they took on more Negro features and became deeply integrated into the society they lived in. They were the intellectuals, scholars, and advisors to kings, playing a key role in the political and cultural life of the region. The cattle Fulani, on the other hand, remained nomadic. They lived apart from settled communities, herding their cattle and maintaining their traditional way of life. Because of this isolation, they retained many of their original Fulani features and remained largely pagan until the 19th century. It was the town Fulani who would make history. They became the torchbearers of Islamic scholarship in the Sahel, preserving the intellectual tradition that survived the fall of Songhai. From their ranks emerged the leaders of the 19th century Fulani Jihad, which will reshape the region forever. And that is where our story ends next. The 19th century was a turning point for Islam in West Africa. It was a time for revival after the religious decline following the fall of Songhai Empire in the 16th century. Led largely by Fulani scholars, this movement swept across the Sahelian region from Hausaland to Senegal and resulted in the creation of powerful Muslim empires in Hausaland, Masina, and Futa Jalon. But what sparked this movement? Let's explore the forces behind the Fulani Jihad. The causes of the 19th century Jihad were complex. While they were primarily religious movements, they were also driven by political, economic, and intellectual factors. At their core, the Jihad were about restoring Islam to its purest form. After the collapse of the Songhai and Mali empires, Islam had entered a period of decline across the Sahelian region. In many of the smaller states that emerged, rulers either practiced paganism or mixed Islam with traditional beliefs. For example, in Zaria, Muslim and pagan rulers alternated power. Jatau, who ruled from 1782 to 1802, was a Muslim ruler, but his son Makau was a pagan who destroyed the mosque his father had built. Even in Borno, while the capital practiced Orthodox Islam, many of its father states remained pagan. Worse still, many Fulani clerics who had settled in pagan states began adopting local customs and abandoning Orthodox Islam. This was especially true in Hausaland, where town Fulani scholars were using their Islamic identity. For devout Muslims like Usman and Fodio, this was unacceptable. By the late 18th century, Orthodox Islam was practiced only in a few areas, such as Futa Toro, Futa Jalon, and Borno capital. This decline angered many Fulani scholars who sought to revive true Islam. Usman and Fodio, for instance, launched his jihad against rulers who mixed Islam with Indian practices. The rise of Muslim brotherhoods like the Tijaniya and the Qadriya also played a key role. This group united scholars across the region, giving the movement a sense of purpose and direction. Usman and Fodio himself belonged to the Qadriya brotherhood. While religion was the primary motive, politics also played a significant role. Across the Sahelian region, the Fulani were often a minority living under pagan or lukewarm Muslim rulers. The settled town Fulani faced harsh conditions. They were taxed heavily, forced to fight in wars against fellow Muslims, and treated as second-class citizens, despite their education and cultural sophistication. This created tensions between the Fulani and their rulers. The jihads in many ways were a tribal struggle for power. Even the Katu Fulani, who were mostly pagan, supported Usman and Fodio out of tribal loyalty rather than religious zeal. Shehu El-Kalemi of Borno, a Muslim himself, accused the Fulani of using religion as a cover to seize political power. The jihads also aimed to reform corrupt governments. Leaders like Usman and Fodio criticized the oppressive taxation, despotic rule, and widespread injustice in many states. In this sense, the jihads were not just religious movement but also called for political change. Economic motives also fueled the jihads. The wealthy town Fulani merchants felt their wealth was under threat due to the jealousy of rulers and farmers. The jihads offered them a chance to create a safer environment for their businesses and properties. Additionally, the Fulani wanted to restore the rule of law and order that had once made trade flourish under the Songhai Empire. They envisioned a unified Islamic state where merchants and travelers could operate securely, just as they had in the past. Finally, the jihad aimed to bring about an intellectual revolution. The leaders wanted to create an ideal Islamic society where everyone lived under the Sharia law. They introduced Malikite law and placed government in the hands of the Fulani aristocracy, who were tasked with enforcing Islamic orthodoxy in their emirates. The Fulani Jihads of the 19th century were driven by a mix of religious, political, economic, and intellectual factors. These factors collectively gave rise to the Muslim reform movement that would go on to reshape West Africa. But what happened after the Fulani successfully overthrew the ruling elites? In the next part, we will explore the Fulani conquest of Hausaland and the establishment of their Islamic emirates. The first major Fulani Jihad of the 19th century took place in Hausaland and its surrounding regions. It was led by an itinerant Fulani preacher and scholar, Usman and Fodio. Born in Maratha Gobi in 1754, he and his brother Abdullahi, born in 1756, were raised as strict Muslims of the Malikai school. Usman furthered his education in Agadez, where he was exposed to reforming ideas that were spreading across the Islamic world at the time. Upon his return to Gobi, Usman settled with his family in the village of Dergel. Around 1774 to 1775, at just 20 years old, he began preaching Islam and calling for religious reform. His travels took him to Kebbi and Samfara, where he gained a significant following. His knowledge and eloquence earned him the admiration of Navata, the king of Gobi, who appointed him as a tutor to his sons. This position further increased his influence. However, in 1802, Navata's son Yunfa, a former pupil of Usman, grew weary of his mentor's rising influence and radical teachings. Fearing the potential threat to his rule, Yunfa and his chiefs began suppressing Usman's movement. In response, Usman and Fodio left the royal court and intensified his call for reform from Dergel. Yunfa, seeing him as a threat, sought to crush his movement by attacking Dergel and attempting to eliminate him. But Usman and his followers managed to escape to Gudu, an area outside Gobi's territory. This escape, which took place on February 21, 1804, is often referred to as the Hijra, symbolizing an open declaration of war against non-believers. At Gudu, Usman and Fodio was joined by his Fulani supporters and a large numbers of Hausa commoners known as Talakawa, who were frustrated by the oppressive Hausa aristocracy. There he was declared Seriki Muslimi, commander of the faithful, officially marking the beginning of the Fulani Jihad in Hausaland. Yunfa responded by sending the Gobi army to crush Usman's forces, but they suffered a crushing defeat. This early victory significantly boosted Usman and Fodio's movement, leading more Fulani warriors to rally to his cause. With momentum on his side, Usman and Fodio began expanding his movement beyond Gobi, aiming to conquer all of Hausaland in order to establish a true Islamic state. To achieve this, he distributed flags to his most trusted followers and leaders of Fulani communities, instructing them to raise armies and wage jihad in their respective regions. He also encouraged these leaders to become emirs upon their victories and establish Islamic governance in their territories. By 1831, the jihad had successfully overthrown the old Hausa rulers, replacing them with 14 Fulani emirates, all of which pledged allegiance to Usman as Caliph with his capital in Sokoto. The jihad had far-reaching effects that extended beyond Hausaland, shaping the course of West African history. Some of its key outcomes include the establishment of the Fulani Muslim Empire, stretching from the Niger River to Lake Chad. This marked the first time that Hausaland experienced some degree of political unity under a single leadership, except Borno, which resisted direct Fulani rule. The empire was divided into two regions. The eastern sector, with its capital at Sokoto, was ruled by Usman Fodio's son, Mohammed Bello. The western sector, headquartered in Gwandu, Hebi, was governed by Usman's brother, Abdullahi. Meanwhile, Usman Fodio retired from political life, focusing instead on religious and intellectual matters. With the conquest of the Hausa state, political control shifted from the Hausa ruling elite to the Fulani aristocracy. However, instead of dismantling the existing system, the Fulani maintained the Hausa administrative structure, modifying it with the introduction of Sharia, which is the Islamic law. The system remained largely intact until the British colonial period and was later preserved under the system of indirect rule. The success of Usman Fodio's jihad inspired similar movements beyond Hausaland, expanding Islam's reach across West Africa, largely eastward to Adamawa, southward to Nope, Ilorin, and also from part of Oyo, also northeast to Borno. In Borno, Fulani's minority elements within Fasa state revolted, leading to the invasion of the capital in Gazagamu and the exile of Mai Ahmed. However, Borno did not fall completely under Fulani's control. The counterattack was led by Mohammed El Kanemi, a learned Kanuri Muslim reformer. He successfully repelled the Fulani, later overthrowing the Mais dynasty and founding the Shehu dynasty of Borno. The Fulani Jihad influenced revolutions across the Western Sahel, particularly in Masina, now Mali, and Futa Jalon in Guinea. These areas experienced similar jihads, further cementing the spread of Islamic rule and governance across the region. The Fulani Jihad in Hausaland left lasting effects on northern Nigeria and beyond, but important questions remain. Was this jihad purely a religious movement, or was it driven by political and economic motives as well? Also, to what extent did it bring true unity to northern Nigeria? Let me know what you think in the comment section. And by the way, if you are curious about how Islam first spread to West Africa, check out my video here, The Spread of Islam in West Africa. It is all connected and you can't afford to miss it. Thank you for watching and see you in my next video.